groundwater that's not buried so far deep so we can get it with our wells. So it's different things. All over the earth, it's split up. But this is just our water that we can use right off the bat. So we know different processes that we can take to make that water so we can drink it. So we can do desalination where we take the salt out of seawater. But this is just the water that we have to begin with. So we take a look at all of that water. Again, all of that water has traveled all over the earth through our water cycles. And when we think about our water cycles, can you hear Marston? It is on. Here it is.
Okay.
Okay, so when we think about our water that moves throughout the earth, it moves through our water cycle. So I want to start, if we think about each of those steps, when we start with the water in our oceans. Oh, can you hear me better?
Yeah.
So we start with our water in our oceans. Thank you very much. When we start with our water in our oceans, and that water starts to heat up, what do you think is that first step in the water cycle? What's that first part of the water cycle? Yes. Evaporation, yeah. So that water evaporates and goes up into the sky. It turns into water vapor. And then what happens next? What's that next step? Oh, yes, condensation. There's one more step. So we have condensation, where that water condenses and forms into those clouds. And then what's that next step? Precipitation, where that water turns into rain, sleet, or snow. And then we have that water which can get into our surface water, so it can turn into those rivers and those lakes and those streams. Or it can become groundwater, where that groundwater percolates or soaks down into our land, and we have our groundwater. But all of that water is going to go through that water cycle and continue that circle and go back into our oceans and start all over again. And that water that I want to focus on today is our surface runoff, because that surface runoff, as it moves over our earth, is moving through something known as a watershed. And our watershed is a land area that drains into a common body of water. So it's how our water moves over the land and ends up into one common place. So I like to think about a watershed by looking at an illustration or looking at a picture. So in this picture, we can see yellow dotted lines. We can see those blue arrows, which show the way that water flows from those areas of high elevations down to those areas of low elevations, being pulled by gravity into that common body of water. But if we take a look at that yellow dotted line, that's what makes up the boundaries between watersheds. It separates one watershed from another. So what do you think makes up those boundaries? What do you think separates one watershed from the second watershed? High elevation points. And what makes up high elevation points here on Earth? Yes? Mountains. Yeah. So when we think about our boundaries between watersheds, we need to look at those higher elevations, specifically those mountains, and take a look at our natural contours of the land, or a natural shape of our land. So how our land is shaped. So when we think about here in San Diego County and how our land is shaped, do you think we have just one watershed or multiple watersheds? What is your guess? What do you think? Do you think we have just one or multiple? Based about when you're driving to school, when you're going to the grocery store, what is your guess? Multiple, yeah. So here in San Diego County, we actually have 11 different watersheds. And those 11 different watersheds are on the screen. So when we think about those 11 different watersheds, and think about where our school is located, maybe thinking about parks that are nearby, the bodies of water that are nearby, I want you to take a guess. In which watershed do you think your school is located in? In which watershed do you think your school is located in? Thinking about what's nearby. Yes? San Diego River is a good guess. Any other guesses? Yes? San Diego Bay. Another good guess. Any other guesses? So when you think about where your school is located, San Diego Bay is a little bit too far south. So we know that here, your school is located in the Peñasquitos Watershed. So right in the middle. So right in the middle of all those different watersheds. have our Peñasquitos Watershed. And when we think of this watershed, where do you think your water drains to? So we know that our boundaries are those mountains, those higher elevations. What do you think our common water body is for the Peñasquitos Watershed? Where do you think all of our water goes? What would be your guess? What's a big body of water that we have? Yes, the ocean. The ocean, exactly. So our water here in the Peñasquitos Watershed ends up draining out into the Pacific Ocean. So that Pacific Ocean is where our water ends up, but I want to take a look at some different places that we might see in our watershed. So we're going to take a little bit of a virtual tour. And while we're looking at these different places, I want you to think of two questions. Have I been to any of these places before? And have I seen pollution at any of these places? So we'll take a look up at those higher elevations, and we're going to be at Watershed Rock. We're moving over to the Miramar Air Base. We can then move to the Miramar Landfill. We then move over to Del Mar Dock Beach. We have Torrey Pines. We're moving over to SeaWorld San Diego. And then where our water drains out into the Pacific Ocean is Mission Bay. So all of these different places, even though they are individual, they are all interconnected because of how water flows over our land. And it flows through our watershed into that common body of water. So all of these places are connected. So when we look at these different places, what do you think? Do you think our watershed is mostly urban, man-made, like cities and neighborhoods and places? Or do you think it's mostly natural? When we have like parks and hiking trails. What would be your guess? Is it mostly urban or natural? Natural. So we do have a lot of natural areas. We have Watershed Rock, we have Mission Bay, and Dock Beach. It doesn't have to just be what's on the screen, but places you visited as well. So maybe natural. Any other guesses? So when you think about it, it can actually kind of be split down the middle. So we have a lot of urban areas, especially when we get into our more populated areas. We have our cities, our schools, our neighborhoods. We also have more towards the eastern portions, our natural areas, our rocks, our mountains, our hiking trails, where we go when we want to get out in nature. So we can really split out our watershed into both urban and man-made areas. So we hit those man-made areas, our nature areas. We know that that water flows over the land into rivers and streams. But what about when it gets to urban areas? Does anyone know how that water might get out into our ocean? How does that water drain when it hits city streets or our neighborhoods? Yes? Through the bay. Through the bay, so it does end up in the bay, but what does it go through to get to the bay? Like drainage pipes? Yeah, drainage pipes. Does anyone know what that system is called? So they go through pipes. It's a type of drainage system. Yes? Storm drains? Exactly, our storm drains. Good job. So when we think about that water, it moves through our storm drain system, especially when we get to urban areas. So when we think about storm drain systems, we have those big grates in the ground. They're usually labeled with those signs that say, "Don't dump hydrate to the ocean," with a dolphin or a duck on them. They then go through underground pipes, through man-made channels, maybe through natural channels like estuaries or rivers, out into our bay, and then eventually out into our ocean. So when we take a look at this storm drain system, does anyone know, are these storm drain systems, are they treated, cleaned, or not cleaned? Not treated. See a lot of people shaking their heads. So our storm drain systems are not treated. They're not looked at, they're not cleaned, they're not filtered. So if you think about our storm drain systems, and if we look at our storm drain systems, this water goes straight out into our oceans without being looked at, without being cleaned, whatever it picks up. So what kind of water do you think storm drains are meant to collect? Based on their name, what kind of water do you think storm drains are meant to collect? Like runoff from the storm? Yeah, runoff from our storms. So rainwater. So if you think about storm drains, they're meant to collect that rainwater. That rainwater, or our storm drains rather, were created to help prevent our city streets from flooding. So it's meant to collect that water really quickly and take it out into our oceans. But because we have those different pollutants, sometimes we see our storm drains put out pollution into our oceans and into our environment. So I want to focus now on our other system, our sewer systems, because sometimes people confuse the two. So if we take a look at our sewer systems, what kind of water do our sewer systems collect? It's not that rainwater. What would be your next guess? Sinks, yeah, so water from our homes. So we have our toilet water, our dishwasher water, our washing machine water, any water that we use in our homes or our buildings. They are collected through a series of pipes and then go out into our oceans. But do you think that water is treated, clean, or not treated? Not clean. What do you think? If it's coming from our homes, is our toilet water and our sink water? What do you think? Is it treated or not treated? A little bit louder? Think it is treated? Any other guesses? I see some nods. Yeah. So our sewer water is treated. That water is clean. It goes through a treatment facility plant. So sometimes it's 3 steps, sometimes it's 4 steps until it's clean enough. It goes through a series of pipes and then out into our oceans. So even though our sewers and our storm drains lead out into the same place, they are 2 separate systems because our storm drains are open to the environment and they do not get cleaned, while our sewer systems are closed off from the environment and they do get treated before they go out into the oceans. But because our storm drain systems collect our water that flows over our earth, when we think about that, we know that there's lots of different pollutants that we see. We see litter, we see lots of different things in our environment that can cause problems. So what we want to make sure of, what we want to focus on, is how we can make our land clean so that our storm drains collect that clean water and take that clean water out into our oceans and our rivers, and they stay clean as well. But unfortunately, here in San Diego County, we're not quite there yet. We have a lot of different pollutants that affect our waterways. So what I want to do next is I want to take a look at some of the main pollutants that we see here in San Diego. And there are 2 main types that we see, which is litter and bacteria. So there are different types of bacteria, different types of litter that we see. But to kind of take a look, I want us to break out into different groups. And I want those groups to take a look at one specific type of pollutant. And what you'll do is once you get to those groups, once you break you out, you'll be at a table with a worksheet, a marker, an eraser, and a jar. And in that jar, you will have a real pollutant sample. So I do ask you to be careful with that jar because it is made of glass. So if you do break it, we're going to have to work together to clean it up. And once you figure out what's inside of those jars, I don't think you'll want to help me clean it up. So just be careful with those jars. You can pick it up, you can move it around, just don't shake it really hard or hit it against the table. So once I break you up into those groups, you will see these questions up on the screen on the worksheet at your table. So you want to first describe the water in the jar. And those jars are labeled, so they might say bacteria station or litter station, but I want you to give it your best guess at what is causing that litter, or what is causing that bacteria, rather than just writing bacteria or litter. Your next question will be, what do you think is inside of this, or what do you think is contaminating this water? How do you think it ended up in the water? And how could this be prevented from getting out into our watersheds? So I'll probably start with 3 people at each table, and then I'll fill in as we go because there are 6 stations. And you'll have about 5 minutes or 6 minutes to look through that jar and to write down your answers. So I'm going to just break it up by row. So if I can have 1, 2, 3, if you can come up the stage for me, and I'll tell you where to go from here. You can come up. Perfect. You're going to come up here, and you're going to go to that first table for me. And if I can have the next 3, if you can come up and come up onto the stage for me as well. That first table. And then if I have our next 3 come up and make their way up for me, you can go to that second table. And then our next 3 can start making their way up. Third table for me on the screen. And then we have our next 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4. If you can come up and come to this table for me. before, come up to this table for me. Yeah, I would, yeah, thank you. And then, if I can have the next two of you can come up on the stage and join the back groups for me. And then our next group of you can all just stand up and I'll separate you into those groups for me. Thank you.
Yes, Thomas. Yes. Can we still go? Sure. Yeah, come on.
Yeah, I'm going to review it now. So if I can have you two split between these two groups. And then if I can have you four up to the table behind me. And then if I can have and then you three can come up on this so that and then you guys can put this back on. Yes. Yes. So you can go ahead and get started. You'll have about 5 minutes. So go ahead and look at that jar and start answering those questions.
Something that you find in your kitchen trash can. What do you think is why did it be harmful? Drink it, see what happens.
There should be one more too. Yes, there should be 2 people. There should be one more person who has dark. Awesome. Perfect. Okay. Yeah. All right. Oh, you're fine. Oh, you don't need to go from the board. Okay, so if you both can do me a favor, if you can first read what your group thought it was, and then if you can read what your group thought.
Okay. So at first we thought it was oil, dirt, bacteria, poop, and feces. We tried to see water.
And then what did you find out is in the jar? Say it a little bit louder.
There was dog poop in the jar.
Yeah, so what we saw in this jar was dog waste.
Nice.
So this is actually one of the #1 things that we see that contribute to bacteria in our environment. Okay, so let's go ahead. We're going to make sure everyone can hear, because we're going to answer that next question. Can you answer the next question for me? Yeah, dog waste has a specific type of bacteria. Has anyone heard of E. coli before? A little bit, some people, yeah, E. coli. Does anyone remember when we had the E. coli outbreak on romaine lettuce, where they took the romaine lettuce off of our shelves, or when there was an E. coli outbreak at Chipotle or the fair? Yeah. So that's E. coli. And E. coli can be one place that E. coli can come from is animals that have a specific diet that eat meat, and that includes our dogs. So our dogs and their waste have E. coli. And then can you read the first question for me?
Where did it come from? And from dogs.
It's from people not thinking about
Sorry.
Awesome. So you can go ahead and make your worksheets here. You can go sit down with me. Thank you very much. So when we think about dog waste is actually pretty harmful in our environment because of that E. coli. So that E. coli can cause problems because once that dog waste breaks down, that E. coli is left behind. And that E. coli, once it gets into our water, can cause a couple of problems. Because if we use that water to water our plants or the food that we eat, like our lettuce or some of our other types of produce, we can become sick and we can become dehydrated. So if you have if you have jar #1 from the bacteria station, if you can bring that jar up in your worksheet as well. Okay, perfect. So you can come a little bit more into the picture. Okay, so if you can both tell the group, what did you think was inside your jar?
Plastic and old food.
Plastic and old food? Yeah. So we see wrappers and food. So when we think about what's in this jar, we saw food waste. So can you read me the second question? Yeah, and then your answer. It can harm the oceans and the environment. How do you think that our food waste can harm our oceans and our environment? Do you have an answer?
Animals can eat it and get sick.
Yeah, definitely. Animals can eat it and get sick. Perfect. Okay. And then where do you think it could come from? Okay, so maybe it can come from stores, so maybe wrappers can kind of, if someone's bringing out their groceries, they might leave things behind. And then what did your group say?
No, we saw it came from like kitchen trash.
Oh, so kitchen trash? Yeah, so it can come from our food waste. Awesome. You can put your worksheets behind you and then go sit down. Wonderful, thank you. So when we think about our food waste, I want to first focus on the food itself. Because that food, even though it's part of our environment, it can actually cause a bit of a problem because it doesn't break down correctly when it's left behind. So if someone ever leaves their banana peel or their apple core just out of the environment, as it breaks down, it releases a specific type of bacteria that can cause a lot of problems. It can cause algae growth or plants that aren't supposed to grow in our waterways and can end up taking up the oxygen from our rivers and from our lakes and from that specific portion of that river or lake and cause animals to die or have to leave that specific portion of our waterways. So when we think of bacteria, how many of you have ever heard of beaches being closed or have ever heard to not go swimming after it rains? Has anyone ever heard that before? And that's because when we have big rainstorm events, because our storm drains are not treated, that water ends up moving through our storm drains and goes straight along our beaches. So they want to protect us from that bacteria that could be in that water and make us sick. So I want to take a look at that last jar. So for our last two folks, people who come up, they had the litter jar. So if you could come up to the front of the room for me, there should be two. Perfect. Great, thank you. So maybe you can just stand right here. Perfect. And then each of you, can you tell the group what you thought was in your jar? Sand, tissue, dirt, or cigarettes? Yeah. And then what did you all think was in your jar?
At first we thought it was like sand, dirt, and stuff.
And then what was actually in the jar?
Cigarettes.
Yeah, so it was the ends of cigarettes, so our cigarette butts. And then if you can answer the second question for me, why could it be harmful? Yeah, so the chemicals, it can hurt our water, especially because people tend to smoke one in a row. So yeah, awesome. Good answer. And then where do you think it could come from?
Cigarettes could come from it could come from the ground or from the beach or the sidewalk or something.
Yeah, wherever those people are smoking. Wonderful. Okay, so you can go ahead and put your worksheets down and then you go sit down for me. So when we think about all of those different items, litter is actually our number one thing that we see, and more specifically, our cigarette butts. They're the number one thing that we see out in our environment when we do cleanups. And that's because this is something that's very prevalent or a lot, that we see a lot throughout our environment. So those cigarette butts can cause a lot of different problems. When those chemicals get into our waterways, one cigarette butt can actually harm 7 liters of water. So that's, if you think about the soda bottles that you get from the grocery store for parties, those are usually 2 liters. So it can harm 3.5 of those soda bottle liters. That's a lot of water that one cigarette butt can harm. Now,